Tim Kelly is our speaker today, and the topic is Brickmakers on Bull Run, and this is, of course, up Bull Run Creek here above Kernville. Tim is going to tie together some dots for us, connect some dots for us. Those dots include the Consolidated Bunnel mining operation, the Harley Mine up on Powers Peak, and a little-known mining engineer and inventor. These events that will connect those dots all took place in the 1870s and 1880s. Tim, as you may remember, has been an archaeologist. He's our resident Kern River Valley mining archaeologist. He's worked for the Forest Service for something like 20 years. He's also been a resident here in the Kern River Valley for something like 35 years, I think. Anyway, welcome, Tim. Thank you.
Thanks. So, this talk is titled Brickmakers on Bull Run, but it's as much about how we know what we know, or at least what we think we know about the past. And so I wanted to talk about start my talk by talking about the sources that I use. And probably the one that started me the most down this rabbit hole has nothing to do with archaeology or history, really. It was the Woodwright's Shop series. As some of you may be familiar, Roy Underhill has had a show on PBS and written a series of books about traditional woodworking. It's the longest running woodworking show, I think, on television history, over 40 years of episodes. He was also the master housewright at Colonial Williamsburg. And while the books in the series are mostly woodworking, he talks about other industries as well, including brickmaking. I used some other sources as well. This is a wonderful little study on the archaeology of brickmaking. Not something that is actually well understood in the world of archaeology. Most archaeologists are pre-contact archaeologists. They study the archaeology of indigenous America. I used some of Lynn Bailey's books. Lynn is a historian, an industrial historian. This one is on shaft furnaces, smelting operations, lime kilns, and so forth in the American West. And this fabulous little book called Riding the High Wire, which is about aerial tramways, including, the Harley Tramway up Powers Peak. I also, as you probably remember, I really enjoy newspaper history. I use a number of online databases for the research for this paper. Mostly it was the Daily Alta California, a San Francisco newspaper that was started in the late 1840s and ran well into the 20th century also. Newspapers in Sacramento and Bakersfield as well. It's little known, but the Havilah Courier, which started in 1866, the printing press for which is back there, moved down to Bakersfield and ultimately became the Bakersfield Californian. It's one of the longest lasting newspapers in California. I use periodicals. My favorite is the Mining and Scientific Press. This was a newspaper published in San Francisco from the 1860s all the way into the 1920s, mostly on the mining industry, but all things industrial. It was kind of the popular mechanics of its time period. Out of these things, there's really four sort of voices that I'm using to guide this study I've done. One is the voices from the past, the people who wrote the historical record. These are the newspaper articles. These are the mining engineers who wrote about what they did. I'm using history, historical works such as Lynn Bailey's or the High Wire book. I am using accounts from craftspeople, modern craftspeople who are working in historic trades, who are sharing their experience with what those trades really looked like and felt like as they were being practiced. And I'm using archaeological studies, and other than the thesis that I wrote on these operations, there hasn't been a lot of studies. So the archaeology I'm looking to is archaeology of similar resources, looking to draw an analogy. For something like this, or for some of the historical context I prepare for the Forest Service, I take all of these different pieces and I put them together and then at least I try, to weave sort of a narrative that connects all those dots, sometimes with better success than others. So In 2009, I was doing field work at the Harley Mine as part of my master's thesis. My thesis was a comparative study of two mines in the Sierra, the Harley Mine here and the May-Lundy Mine up in Mono County near Lee Vining. This was going to be a comparative study. The mines were in many ways quite similar. Both were active in the 1870s and early 1880s. Both were located in really extreme terrain. Slopes that are approaching vertical in places. They're really remote from their nearest communities. The Harley Mine is some 3,000 feet higher than old Kernville, and a 3.5, 4 mile hike if you use the old Miners Trail to connect the dots. The May-Lundy Mine is almost 4,000 feet higher than the nearest town, which was Lundy, and about a 3 mile hike. In both cases, these are pretty stiff hikes. If you've ever walked the Miners Trail from behind Jamesthorpe to the mine, you'll have a clue what it would have been like. Both mining operations had 20 stamp mills. Both had aerial tramways that were constructed by the California Wire Works using the patents of Andrew Halliday. Halliday, of course, was the guy that invented the San Francisco cable car system. These were both obviously gold mines. Interestingly, they had very, very different trajectories. They were both active in the 1870s and 1880s. The May-Lundy Mine, however, remained active all the way into the 1930s and arguably is still active. The claims are still actively owned. There is occasional talk when gold is high, which of course it is really high right now, of reopening the mine, even though it's located in a wilderness area now and be quite challenging. The Harley Mine, of course, closed down sometime around 1882 when the tramway failed and the cost of shipping ore became exorbitant. Another interesting difference between these operations is that the May-Lundy Mine had really substantial accommodations for the miners up at the mine itself. Again, it's 4,000 feet above the town of Lundy. Walking to work wasn't really an option, and so they had well-developed bunkhouses and boarding houses, which are not quite the same thing. The boarding houses had better accommodations and a wider range of services available. Laundry, better meals, and so forth. There was a kitchen up there, there was a commissary, there was a blacksmith shop, there were warehouses for food, there were warehouses for mining supplies, there was an explosives bunker. Many of these were made out of heavy dry set stone masonry, and their roof lines lined up with the slope so that avalanches would just slide over and off these things rather than tearing them out. Others were well built out of lumber, board and batten siding. Some were 2 stories, shake shingle roofs. Really, really well developed, and they survived fairly well. When I was doing my thesis research, you could really make out the purpose for each and the shape of the buildings. At the Harley Mine, we don't really see this. There is, of course, the chimney. You see this in Bob Power's book. There's a photo here on the bottom right that I took in 2009. This, according to Bob, is the superintendent's residence. There are scattered around the site as well a number of sort of leveled spaces where maybe there could have been shacks or buildings of some sort. But there's no real evidence that buildings were present, actually. So at the chimney, we don't find any evidence of walls. There are no foundations or footings. It's possible, of course, that a wooden building might have burned to the ground, but if so, we would expect to see some sort of remnants of flashing on the chimney where the roof was, or maybe lines of nails left over after the fire, and we don't find these things there. Similarly, as well, across the site, there's not a lot of milled wood. I mean, again, a fire could have taken care of that, but there aren't really a lot of nails up there either. And so there's no real evidence that there was anything more than canvas tents up on top of the peak, and that might not have been the most comfortable situation for the miners, of course. A number of reasons for this possibly. I mean, there's not a lot of timber up there. It's a pinyon, juniper, gray pine, very slender sort of timber stand up there. And there, as we'll see, there were sawmills working elsewhere that could have provided that timber. The lack of timber, though, was not an issue at the May-Lundy. They were very successful in bringing lumber in, either on the aerial tramway itself or with packed stock. So availability of timber didn't really seem to be a solid explanation. And so in my thesis, I speculate a bit about why we don't see a lot of evidence of occupancy. But my best guess is that possibly the miners might not have spent a lot of time up there. Among other things, there's not a lot of domestic refuse either. At the Maylundi mine, there are tens of thousands of artifacts, cans, tobacco tins, butchered bone, glassware, alcohol bottles, medicine bottles. I mean, all the stuff of, late 19th century domesticity. There are some of these things at the Harley mine, but nothing like the numbers. There are a few hundred artifacts that suggest that there was some sort of domestic occupation, but not what you would expect for a small community that would have lived there for 5 or 6 years. Conceivably, they walked to work, but again, that was a hell of a walk. 4 miles each way. I made that hike quite a lot during my thesis. It was kind of miserable, and these guys would then, after having walked up there, would have to put in a 10 to 12-hour shift underground, which was also brutally hard work. So that didn't seem very likely as well. Bob Powers suggests that the miners had some sort of contrivance where they could ride the wire up to the mine. This was a common practice with aerial tramways. The photo on the right here is taken in Colorado near Silverton. These are miners riding a blight cart aerial tramway from down on the Animas all the way up into Silver Lake Basin. I mean, it looks extremely sketchy, but this was very, very common practice. There's a similar photo actually in the cover of the Highwire book as well. And so conceivably, the miners may have done something like that here. The California Wire Works actually had a little gondola that they manufactured for riding these things. And in fact, in Colorado, and the ski industry got started in the 1930s, in some places they simply retooled the aerial tramways from the mining industry to become early ski lifts. So it seems possible that occupancy just wasn't really a big deal. The miners had a way to commute somehow, and they didn't spend a whole lot of time living up there. But interestingly, something that I saw floating around the site up there were bricks, which suggests that at some point there was some idea of building more substantial accommodations. Only a couple hundred bricks up at the site, and that was quite a puzzler as I was wandering around up there. The choice of building materials in the Southern Sierra is kind of interesting because there's a huge range from stone to adobe to lumber to dry set stone, cut stone, mortared stone, and bricks. These are very much vernacular architecture. That's a phrase that you often see when you read of historical archaeology in the American West, and oftentimes the term is used to imply simple construction, crude construction, maybe really poor materials, perhaps as a result of the location. But that's not really what the term means. Vernacular architecture is a local tradition of building that is shaped by the availability of materials. Until the late 1850s, there wasn't a lot of building material that was available for purchase down here. Gold was discovered in 1854, but it was 2 years before Sawyer arrived in the valley when 1856 Myron Harmon appeared on scene with his whipsaw, and he would hand saw lumber for you in Keysville. By the end of the 1850s, he'd moved up to the Greenhorns near Spout Spring, and he constructed the first sawmill down here. In the 1860s, you had several others appear up in the Greenhorns. There was a sawmill up on Breckenridge supplying lumber to Havilah. By the 1870s, you had sawmills also in the Paiutes. And of course, in the mid-1870s, the Big Blue Mine built a sawmill in Waggy Flat to supply timber for the mine as well as for their construction of the Big Blue Mill and all the other infrastructure that they were building during the middle of the decade. Even though we had sawmills, it was still a long way to haul timber. I mean, the roads up here were rough, often really steep. Imagine hauling a wagon full of lumber off of Greenhorn Summit. Oftentimes you would fell a tree and chain the wheels of your wagon to the tree and drag the thing down the hill so it doesn't overrun your horses and kill your team. So we see a lot of very localized materials being pushed into service. I mean, obviously the Sierra is a world of stone and of dirt. And so in Walker Basin, down on Caliente Creek, in Havilah, we see adobe buildings, one visible here in the bottom left in Havilah. And we also see buildings made out of stone, either dry set stone, like we see a little bit up at the Harley Mine Complex, but also in Bull Run Creek and a couple other places. And then you see mortared stones, such as you see in Havilah. You know, one of the remaining buildings from when the town was the county seat is of mortared stone. We don't see a lot of brick construction in the area, though, which is interesting. Most Western mining towns went through a sort of a fire cycle in their early history. The towns were built out of really crappy material, brush and sticks and a little bit of lumber and canvas, and typically they burned to the ground. They would then rebuild again with a little bit more standardized materials. By then, you know, usually in the first few years, your sawyers or your sawmills appeared. So they would build in lumber, and the town would burn to the ground again. And so oftentimes in the second or third or fourth iteration, they would get sick of it and they would build in brick. We see this all over Nevada, Austin and Eureka, for example, up in the Mother Lode country as well. Oftentimes you'll see fireproof doors on these buildings too, these big iron doors that you'd fold shut to keep the fire from entering your building. We don't see that down here very much. Very little of the way brick construction down here. Are a few brick buildings in Kernville. I'm not aware of any brick buildings that were in Havilah, Solitaire, Keysville, Sageland. These were all apparently built from lumber, and there's very little that remains of them. One of the really interesting things about the bricks up at the Harley Mine is they're really crappy. And I have some here that you can see in this brick here. There are huge chunks of quartz in it. These bricks have a lot of, you know, pebbles and bits of quartz and whatnot in their matrix. The bricks are rather crude. This is one of the better bricks, and you can see very visible striations. This is where the brick was molded, and they scraped the mud off. Oftentimes the bricks are not really that square, as we see with this one. And when I was wandering around up at the Harley Mine, it occurred to me that maybe this poor quality suggested that they were actually made up at the site. Brickmaking, as we'll see in a minute, it is a pretty simple process. You need clay, and you need a place to dry your bricks and a place to fire them. But if you've ever wandered around up there, you know that there's very little in the way of level space where you could dry those bricks. And so it seemed unlikely to me that they were actually made up there. But the Harley Mine had an aerial tramway, and so they had a very easy way to transport bricks from the bottom of the hill to the top. The Harley Mine tramway was gravity powered. The mine's at the top of the hill, the mill's at the bottom. It's an endless cable, and so the weight of the loaded cars of ore would pull the empty cars up to the top of the mountain. So you could put a few bricks in each of those buckets and haul them back up to the mine essentially for nothing. And so that suggested to me that the bricks probably came from somewhere else. And in 2009, I was only aware of 2 other places in the valley where you find any quantity of bricks, and both of those are in Bull Run. One of which is at the Consolidated Bunnell Stamp Mill, which incidentally was also a Charles Harley property. And so having shared ownership suggested that they probably had a shared source. And the other site in Bull Run is a small site located down in the flats about a mile below the mill. And here you have some piles of bricks and sort of an anomalous pit feature and a larger mound with a lot of these really overburned bricks. So I took a quick walk after I found those bricks up on top of the hill, and I walked up to the Bunnell mine and also to this other site, and I confirmed that these bricks were of the same quality. They also have all this junk in the matrix. They also have really coarse tooling marks from being molded. Many of them are really badly warped. Some look like they may have been dropped while they were still green and they're bent. Some are really cracked, and a few look like they're actually kind of melted. So this is a brick wall in Bodie. These are also a very similarly poor quality of brick. You see similar inclusions here and here, big one up in here. The finish of the bricks is also very uneven. You've got really smoothly finished bricks here, but less so with these. If you sight down the wall, the bricks themselves are uneven, which leads to a really uneven wall. But I'm not actually timing, Linda. Next time I'll do 11. So I'm not suggesting that the bricks in Bodie came from the same source as the bricks that we see in Bull Run, but rather what I am thinking is that what we're seeing is a similar technology used to produce the bricks, and this produced similar results. Brickmaking does not need to occur at any kind of industrial level. The site that I found in Bull Run with the piles of brick in the small circular pit reminded me actually of one of the episodes in the Woodwright's Shop, a chapter in this book here where he describes making bricks in colonial Williamsburg using the original techniques that were used in the late 18th century. At the time, in the 18th century and the 19th century in the eastern seaboard, you literally could call brickmaking a cottage industry. Many of the houses that were built then, they would begin by excavating the basement. They would use the clay that they dug out of the basement hole, and they would manufacture bricks on site for building the chimney and the walls. Really all you need to make bricks is a source of clay, a place to mix it into some sort of semi-homogeneous consistency, a place to dry the bricks, and a place to fire them. And this operation here dates to sometime in the latter half of the 1800s. It's somewhere up in Oregon or Washington, and this gives you an idea of the simplicity really of brick making. You've got a wheel pit here, which I'll talk about more in a bit. You've got people molding bricks on sort of a trestle table back here, and you have the furnace that they use to fire the bricks. The wheel pit is a really simple device that you use to mix the clay. It works kind of like an arrastra. It's a circular pit, and you mount a wheel on a horizontal axle, and it goes around and around and around. Hopefully you can hitch it to a mule. Sometimes you'd liquor up your friends and they'd carry it around for you. If you don't have a wheel pit, you could also mix the clay with bare feet. This is what they do in Williamsburg and in historic Jamestown. Oftentimes they Shanghai, school groups and get the kids to do the mixing for them. When you've mixed your mud, you mold it, and the molding is really a simple process. You use a simple wooden mold. This one molds 2 bricks at a time. You ball your clay up into sort of a cantaloupe size, maybe a little bit larger ball, and you ram it into the mold. And the trick with mixing your clay is it needs to be of a consistency that's soft enough that it will fill the mold, but it's also firm enough that when you pick the mold up, it doesn't slop all over your feet. You pack the thing up, you scrape it off with a straight edge. This is where you get these striations across the top of the bricks. Here is from the scraping. And you carry the thing out into a field and you lay these things out to be sun-dried. And every day or so you flip the bricks over, you continually turn them until they're evenly dried. Brick making is highly weather dependent. A good rainstorm will completely destroy all of your work. Up in the Midwest, I've read some stories of entire brickyards being wiped out, hundreds of thousands of bricks by a single summer storm. One of the things that's really interesting about this small-scale brick making is that it's ultimately self-consuming. Really developed brickyards had substantial kilns or furnaces where they would fire their bricks, but for small-scale brick making, that's just not practical. And so the brickmakers would build the kiln literally out of the bricks that they were firing. It's called a clamp. And so you lay it out as sort of a honeycomb. You build the thing 6-8 feet tall. You vault the ceilings over the open spaces to enclose the thing. All of the bricks will ultimately be used for construction later on. And then you fill those open spaces up with fuel wood, leaving passages for air to flow through the thing. in a controlled manner. When complete, you daub mud or clay over the whole thing to keep air from seeping in through the walls, and you fill it up with firewood and you light the thing off. It takes about a quart of hardwood to produce 1,000 bricks. The firing occurs over a period of like 5 or 6 days. The temperature inside this thing will get to be well over 2,000 degrees. Oftentimes when you throw a hunk of firewood into the thing, as you're feeding it, it will literally burst into flame before it even hits the ground. It's so hot in there. The bricks are clay, and so they're loaded full of water, and so as you are firing this thing, it produces huge clouds of steam, and the bricks shrink. And as they shrink, the walls of the clamp, both internal and external, will start to deform, and the thing will sort of collapse on itself a bit, which is why you get bricks that are sometimes deformed. This is because of the collapsing walls. Sometimes whole interior walls will fall over altogether into the fire, and this is where you get the really bent or smashed looking bricks. At about day 5 or 6, you stop feeding the fire. You put iron doors on all of the spots where you're feeding the fire, and you seal the thing off. This creates a reducing atmosphere. The remaining smoldering fire consumes all the oxygen, and the lack of oxygen helps with vitrification. It turns the bricks from clay into something really that's kind of akin to stone. When you tap a really well-fired brick, it sounds like glass almost, or ceramic, because that's kind of what it is. This process produces 3 classes of bricks. Samel bricks are the ones that were located furthest from the fire. These are going to be soft. They're not terribly weatherproof. This is a good example of a Samel brick. They deteriorate rather quickly. They're not fully vitrified, and so you can't use them for exterior construction, but you can use them for interior construction, or if you've got walls that are several courses thick, you can use them in the interior of those walls. Clinker bricks are the bricks that were located closest to the fire. These are oftentimes a purple color like this, almost black sometimes. The bricks closest to the fire are the ones that were most likely to have problems with the walls shifting, and so oftentimes they're going to be deformed. Sometimes they'll be cracked because they heated too quickly or cooled too quickly. Clinker bricks, though, are really solid and competent for construction when they are shapely enough that you can actually fit them into your wall. Brick masons sometimes like to use clinker bricks decoratively. They'll lay in a whole line of clinker bricks in a wall or in a fireplace. Sometimes they will sort of randomly scatter them to break up the monotony of a brick red wall. And then in between the Samels and the clinkers, you have kind of your standard brick. This is, fairly flat and square. It is fully vitrified. It is solid for construction. It is weatherproof. You can use it as exterior brick or interior brick. These were sometimes classed into several different levels as well. Depending on the brickyard, they use different classifications, but they're graded as to hardness or quality. The harder ones are the more rectangular ones, being a higher grade and maybe a little more expensive than the ones that were less so. So once you got a pile of bricks, though, you still need something to stick it all together. Unlike stone construction, which you can accomplish without mortar, bricks don't interlock very well, and they don't produce a very solid wall unless you mortar it together. Manufacturing concrete seems like, at least in this day and age, a really industrial activity. If you take a drive over Highway 58, in the Tehachapi area, you'll see Monolith, which is the concrete plant that was first built by the Department of Water and Power in the early 1900s to supply concrete for the Los Angeles Aqueduct. It's a massive complex of rotary kilns and grinding machines, hoppers. There's a railroad siding. They feed off the products of the plant, both mortar and concrete, as well as quicklime to other industries. But you really don't need any kind of industry at all to produce the basic ingredients for some simple mortars and concretes. These 2 photos show lime kilns north of here. The one on the right is the kiln that was used in Aurora, Nevada. Aurora was a boom town in the 1860s. Unlike most mining camps that went through this cycle I described of, poor construction and then, lumber construction and the brick construction, Aurora was located so far from decent stands of timber that they didn't have an option for building with lumber, but fortunately they had clay and limestone nearby, and so they were able to make their own bricks. There were 5 brickyards in Aurora, and they were able to produce their own mortar using the lime kiln here. At its heyday, the entire downtown of Aurora was built all entirely of brick. The other one is a smaller kiln. It's located on the north shore of Mono Lake. It was used to provide lime for construction purposes and mining purposes in Bodie, and as well as for construction around the Mono Basin. One of the neat byproducts of being able to produce your own lime is you can also use it in the milling of certain types of ore. If your ore body has a lot of chlorides in it, which interfere with amalgamation, you can roast that ore with some lime, and the chlorides will mix with the calcium in the lime and produce calcium chloride, which is chalk. And this reduces the chlorides in the ore and makes it more amenable to amalgamation. But even these are rather more industrial than you actually need to produce a basic amount of quicklime. These photos are of a furnace that was built up in Norway about a decade ago by a group of historical archaeologists. And this is the sort of thing that you could have easily built in this valley here. All that's really necessary is a source of limestone or dolomite, marble, travertine. Travertine is a mineral that is produced when limestone caves are formed or karstic landscapes are formed. Tufa is what they were using up in the Mono Basin. Basically, you need something that's got a lot of calcium in it. You build a simple stone structure. You can build it actually out of the limestone or marble, whatever it is that you're firing. Inside the thing, you build a vaulted firebox. You use sort of triangular pieces stacked together until they sort of collapse upon themselves, leaving an open space. This is where your firewood will go. On top of this vaulted ceiling, you fill your circular structure with cobbles of your limestone or whatever material you're using. These can be fist size to maybe orange size. You fill the thing up level, you leave a flue so that the fire within will be able to breathe. When you filled the thing up, you cover it over with pine boughs and then clay. You daub the walls of the thing with clay as well. The idea is to control the airflow through the thing. You want it only through the firebox door and out the flue. And then you fire the thing up, and you run the thing for 5-6 days. At which time the material within, including some of the walls of the thing and that vaulted ceiling, will have converted to lime. Oftentimes all of this will sort of collapse into the fire, and you'll have a bunch of powder at the bottom and maybe really soft, sort of chalky cobbles. This resulting material is then slaked, which is a great word. All you really do is you add water to it, like slaking your thirst. But this produces a really violent reaction. It's exothermal, which means it produces a lot of heat. This thing will bubble like a volcano, and you'll have a huge cloud of steam that comes off of it. And at the end of the process, you have a really fine white to maybe ivory-colored powder. This is quicklime, and this is what you use to make mortar. You mix it with sand and water, and you have a simple concrete. You mix it with hair and water, and you have plaster, which you can use in interior surfaces. If you just mix it with water by itself, you have whitewash for painting things. And again, you can also use it in the mining industry. The mortar this produces isn't terribly durable. It only lasts a few decades. If you ever took a geology class, you remember that you take a little bit of acid and put it on limestone and it bubbles. It's still going to be really reactive to acid, and rainwater, of course, is slightly acidic. And so in time, this will dissolve out of your mortar, and your brick wall is only going to be held together with sand, which isn't terribly effective. At Aurora, by the 1920s, all those downtown buildings were starting to fall apart, and this is when used brick became really popular as a building material, a decorative building material in Los Angeles and the Bay Area, and so all those buildings disappeared. The bricks are still present, but they're going to be in chimneys and fireplaces in Los Angeles and the Hollywood Hills and so on. So we've walked through the process of making your bricks and making the mortar to put them together. So Where does that leave us in terms of the bricks that we're finding at the Harley Mine and up in Bull Run? It seems like every year I'm asked 3 or 4 times, maybe more, about that weird facility at Bull Run. You know, they call it a brick factory, or they call it some sort of industrial complex. The weird terraces with the bricks, all those stone walls and so forth. In a nutshell, this is the Consolidated Bunnell Mill. It shows up in this photo, this map from 1882. This is a general land office map, as well as the mine road that led down the canyon. It's a wonderful map, shows all kinds of stuff going on up the river as well, and a house down, presumably somewhere around where Ruby City is. In 1875, John Dunn and Albert Bunnell made a gold and silver strike in Bull Run Canyon. The April 6, 1875 Daily Alta California described this discovery. They wrote, quote, "For more than 12 years past, prospectors have been in the habit of finding rich gold and silver bearing float rock on an extensive flat near an affluent of the Kern River called Bull Run, but without meeting success in their efforts to trace it up. This piece of good luck was reserved for John Dunn and Albert Bunnell." So float are pieces of an ore body that have been broken off by natural processes, frost wedging, mass wasting events, earthquake activity, and so on. And it tumbles down the hillside, is carried down, sometimes into a creek bed by a combination of gravity and fluvial action. And the miners, when they encountered these things, would trace it back up to their source. They would look at the morphology of the float. The edges are really rounded. That tells you that it came a long ways. If they're really jagged, maybe not so much. And apparently, as it says here, this was well known to the miners of this valley, but they had not found the source. The miners jumped right to it, though. Within a few days, they were actually working on their claims. And they staked out those claims under the bylaws of the Cove Mining District, which is a little interesting because the Cove Mining District didn't actually extend all the way up here. One of the real bummers of making a strike like this is that most miners who prospected didn't have a lot of money, whereas developing a mine costs a lot of money. The Spaniards used to say that it takes a gold mine to run a silver mine. And so in June, Bunnell and John Dunn formed a partnership with Robert Butts, Daniel Thornton, J.S. Collins, Albert Bunnell's brother James, and Eunice Butts to further prospect and develop these mining claims. They also filed a water claim on Bull Run Creek for the likelihood that at some point they would have a mill. The purpose of this partnership likely was to raise a little bit of capital. The idea, generally with these sorts of mining strikes, is to develop it enough to attract some sort of financier who could then fund enough capital into the venture to fully develop it. And in this case, the gambit was apparently successful because in February of 1876, they signed a contract with Charles Harley. Under the terms of this contract, and this contract is actually down in the Hall of Records in Bakersfield, Harley was to provide, quote, a 10-stamp mill at his own expense at the Bunnell Mill, so-called, in the Cove Mining District in Kern County, and put the same in running order. The stamps are to be of 800 pounds weight each. Said mill to include 2 settlers, 1 crusher, 1 roasting furnace, 1 Lafell turbine wheel, all to be of the best kinds, and all to be enclosed in a sufficient wooden building. Also to build a road from Kernville to said mill, also a water ditch to convey water from Bull Run Creek to the mill. Harley was to be compensated with a half interest in the mining operation, both in terms of the ownership of the property, but also in any of the profits from the operation. As this was happening, though, there was a fight brewing up in Bull Run Creek. A group of miners had essentially claim jumped. They had top-filed over the Bunnell's claim. An article in the Mining and Scientific Press wrote, reports of the marvelous richness of the Bunnell claim continue to accumulate, but the biggest thing they have on their hand now is an adverse claim and a prospective expensive lawsuit. We have informed that the mine was jumped on Monday last, the parties taking possession and holding it with shotguns and other playthings. So this was a common practice with the mining laws in the 1870s and all the way up into about the turn of the century. Mining on public lands is kind of an interesting thing because Under the mining law of 1872, when you have a mining claim, you own the mineral estate within the bounds of that claim, but you don't actually own the land. The land remains the property of the federal government until it is patented, and most miners didn't have the wherewithal to actually patent their lands. The bylaws of the mining district defined how that ownership extended underground. Oftentimes, the bylaws specified that if you had a ledge that outcropped on your mining claim, you owned the entire ledge, whether it went straight down or whether it actually went beyond the boundaries of your mining claim on the surface, which led to all sorts of litigation. And litigation was probably the most profitable product of the 19th century mining industry. And so claim jumping, top filing of this sort was a common practice. The goal wasn't to seize control of the mine. The goal was to trigger sufficient litigation so that the mining company that had originally claimed it would simply give in and give you an ownership stake in the mining claim. And that's what happened here. The claim jumpers received ultimately a 2/5 percentage of the mining company. The original owners received a 3/5 ownership. It's not clear how this affected Charles Harley's ownership at all. In October, they all organized a new mining company called the Cove Mining Company. It was capitalized with 10,000 shares valued at $100 each. The directors of the company were Ambrose Blatchley, Charles Harley, Thomas Prince, Frank McCann, and Jacob Dunn. Interestingly, the Bunnells have already washed out of this. It was oftentimes the case that new mining companies would finance their operations by assessing the shareholders. This is something that's no longer allowed by the Securities and Exchange Commission. And so if you had a mine and you wanted to build a stamp mill that was going to cost $50,000, you would look to those 10,000 shares and you would assess a $5 fee for each of those shares. So if you owned 100 shares, you would have to pay $500 to the mining company or you would lose your shares. Many of the mining companies, that's all they did. They didn't actually develop anything. They just continually assessed the shareholders until somebody finally called foul. In February, Ambrose Blatchley traveled to the Kern Valley and began construction on the company's mill and associated infrastructure. In July, the Mining and Scientific Press reported that the tunnel had now advanced 150 feet. Developments continue, very flattering. The flume is completed and a fine head of water has been flowing through it for 6 weeks past to the lower mill site. The mill building, offices, and shops are finished, and the only delay in the placing of the machinery is the want of brick now being made near the mine. It is expected to have the 10 stamps running within a month. By September, the mill was completed at a cost of $70,000. If you've ever hiked up Bull Run beyond the end of the road and you look up those big granite slabs, you see a series of little steps carved into the rock. These are footings for the wooden flume that carried water down to the turbines of the mill. You can see footings further up. There's in places a miner's ditch as well that circles kind of along on a more or less level contour up to, a ways up the creek. This again was reflected with the ownership, by the ownership of the water by the company. LaFell turbines are kind of interesting because they don't require a lot of pressure to operate, just a large volume of water. And one of the things that affected this company negatively in the years to come is that Bull Run Creek is pretty seasonal and you need a lot of volume to run that turbine, and so there were a lot of months of the year when they simply did not have enough to operate. The photo here shows the remains of the mill. You've got the mill site itself here with the multiple levels where different suites of machinery operated. Down in here, you've got the remains of the assay shop. The tailings pond is located down here. Just beyond, off to the left, you've got a series of roads that come up to the different levels of the mill, and then there's one that comes back down again. Sort of a weird impoundment going on over here of leftover rock from construction of the footings. We know that the mill operated for some time. The tailings pond is pretty substantial. Tailings are, it's an interesting word. You talk to people about mines. I went to a neat mine out in the Mojave Desert. They'll tell you there's a big, huge tailings pile. Mostly what they're talking about is waste rock, the rock that the miners removed as they were digging their tunnel. Strictly speaking, tailings are the product of a mill. They're going to be a really fine, sort of like powdered sugar or flour consistency. Oftentimes they're a tan color or maybe even a pink or reddish color, depending on how the tailings were treated. And there's a bunch of them at the Bunnell Mill. Clearly the mill operated for a decent length of time. They were, however, beset by a number of problems. I've already mentioned the issues with Bull Run Creek. Interestingly, despite the fluctuating water levels, the mine itself produced a lot of water, and they had flooding problems in the mine. They actually considered drilling a lower elevation adit to drain the thing. This is actually, if you know where to look, you can find the thing. We put back gates in there around 2009. It looks like it goes back perhaps 1,500 feet, intersects the upper workings. They also had problems with the equipment. Charles Harley had been contracted to provide machinery of the best sort, but he didn't really. Charles Harley was a junk dealer in San Francisco and a marine salvage operator, and he apparently bought very, very secondhand machinery for the mine. The machinery failed. He sued the suppliers. This went through several rounds of appeal in the courts, and ultimately were decided against him. Charles Harley was not terribly lucky in courts ever. It actually developed case law that's been used as recently as the 1980s. Basically, the warranty of secondhand items has to be well defined in order to be actionable. And in the case of Charles Harley, it hadn't been. The court opined that he could have laid out his expectations as to quality and functionality when he contracted for it, but since he didn't, the problem was his and not the supplier's problem. So I mentioned that Ambrose, I am missing a page here. So I've not found any photographs of the Bunnell mining operation, either up at the mine or down at the mill. If ever those things pop up, I would love to see them. This illustration comes out of a treatise on silver mining by Eisler, 1889, and it shows a very similar mill based on what we see on the ground as well as in the Charles Harley contract. I mentioned before that the mill up on Bull Run is at multiple levels. We see that reflected here with these different levels. And then there were roads that came in at a middle level and at an upper level. And so what would happen is that the miners would ship their ore down to the mill in a wagon. The wagon would bring it up to the top of the mill. It would move into a hopper that's not shown here. The hopper had a grate in it. The bigger rocks would be caught by the grate and they would be fed into this jaw crusher. The smaller rocks would be fed down and immediately into the hopper that feeds the stamp mill. The jaw crusher would break the rock down into sort of golf ball to maybe fist-sized cobbles. These would then also go into the hopper for the stamp mill. The stamp mill, again, this is a 10 stamp mill with 10 800-pound stamps. This would crush the rock into sort of a sand, like beach sand or river sand consistency. Mercury would be added into the hopper here. This is that cast iron box that the stamps fall into, and amalgamation would begin right at this level. The sands and the amalgam would be discharged across copper plates. The copper plates, oftentimes these were silver plated. The mercury amalgam would stick to those plates. The sands would then be discharged into yet another hopper. At this hopper, there's a conveyor belt that feeds it to the top of a roasting furnace. This is the whole point of the bricks that were being made in Bull Run. This is where the delay in the construction of the mill was, because they had to complete the furnace of brick before they could finish placing the conveyor belt, the hoppers, and the chutes that then fed the stuff out of the furnace into the other levels of the mill. So the roasting furnace, the idea is to drive off the sulfides and chlorides that are in the ore body. It had a series of shelves in it, and the ore would work their way from shelf to shelf to shelf through the thing before finally being discharged at the base of it. From there, the material would go to a pan amalgamator. A pan amalgamator is the circular device. It's kind of like a mechanized arostra. You got this big iron plate. at the base of it. It's got a circular enclosure, and there were molars, these iron, a little bit of feedback there, these iron shoes essentially that would work around and around, and it would grind those fine sands into almost like a powdered sugar, floury sort of consistency. You would add mercury to the thing, and amalgamation would occur here as well. You could put steam heat to the bottom of it, which would accelerate the process. Amalgamation is like any other chemical reaction in that the hotter it is, the faster it proceeds. The amalgam will be scraped off. These guys, it's hard to imagine. These guys actually ball the stuff up. They're taking the mercury, and they sort of ball the stuff up, and they would set it aside for retorting. The sands that were left from the amalgamator go to a settler. This is a device kind of like a mechanized gold pan, and it would separate the sands out by weight. The heavier sands were thought to still contain precious metal. Those would go back into the pan amalgamator, whereas the sands remaining from the first round of settling would go to a second round of settling, and this would cycle back and forth between the pan amalgamator a few times. Ultimately, all the amalgam would be collected and retorted. Basically, you put it into a big cast iron chamber, you'd heat it to about 1500 degrees Fahrenheit, the mercury would vaporize, hopefully and go into a condenser to be recycled, and you'd be left with sort of this spongy mass of gold and silver. You would then send that to a smelter such as the Shelby smelter up in the Bay Area to be refined into bullion. The remaining sands would be discharged into your tailings pond. Oftentimes, they'd just be discharged into the nearest Handy River. That's what we saw at the Big Blue, for example. If you have a tailings pond, sometimes they could be reworked as technology improved. As an aerial shot of the mill, again, you see the floor of the mill itself. This is where the stamps would have been located. The brick chimney, the furnace, is located right here. This would have been 30 or 40 feet high. When I first lived here, there was still a visible arch for the firebox made out of with a keystone, as it were, so you've got a vaulted firebox. That's since collapsed. I'm sure you all know a lot of these bricks were salvaged and used in houses along Soretta Street and whatnot in early Kernville to produce chimneys and fireplaces and whatnot. This is where the tailings pond is located. You see these sort of pinkish, reddish sands. The coloration is indicative of roasting. There is iron in most of the ore bodies of this area, and when you heat that accelerates oxidation, and so the ore rusts, and that rust gives you this sort of pinkish, orangish, red color. You also see, like the walls for the assay shop, some of the other infrastructure located here. You can see the road that went to the top of the mill, as well as the middle level of the road, and the one that came back down the other side. So Ambrose Blatchley is a really interesting guy. He was the mining engineer for the Charles Harley Company. He first appears, that I've seen so far, in the mining records sometime around 1860. He was working in Copperopolis up in the Motherlode country. Copperopolis was unique in the Motherlode country in that the precious metals they were working weren't gold. It was a silver and copper mine. He was a secretary for the mine and also the mine's assayer. By the early 1860s, he'd moved on from Copperopolis to central Nevada. He was in Austin for a period of time. In 1865, he may have written a book on silver mining, and in 1867, another one on the mining in the Reese River area, including in Austin. It's a little difficult to trace him during these years because there was another Blatchley who was also a mining engineer whose first name also began with the letter A. It was Alan Blatchley, and both of them tended to sign their works A. Blatchley, which is a little bit confusing. I suspect they might be brothers, but I haven't had a chance to trace down their genealogy, but it's not the most common of names anyway. He was well established, though, as an assayer and mining engineer in California by the early 1870s. Obviously he was hired by Charles Harley in 1876. He was here in Kernville that year to build the consolidated Bunnell. He was back again to build the aerial tramway for the Harley mine a couple years later. But he was really a polymath. He considered himself more an inventor than a mining engineer. He had a whole series of inventions. He invented rock drills for mining, a desulfurizing furnace, which works similar to the furnace I was describing at the Bunnell mine. We have a cross-section of the patent, or the drawings from the patent here. In essence, what it is an endless chain that moves through the furnace, and it sort of churns the ore up. I talked about how you've got all these shelves within the furnace, and each of those shelves you would have one of these chain systems which turns the ore over and gives a more even roasting to the ore. He invented a sewer gas trap, a variety of roasting devices, and perhaps most famously, he invented a raisin dryer. In 1873, the California raisin industry was just getting started in the Fresno area, but by the turn of the century, it was the largest raisin industry in the world, and this is because of Blatchley's raisin dryer, his patented raisin dryer. It seems likely, that he took his experience in the mining industry and with all these different roasting furnaces and applied them more broadly. And so, I promised in the beginning to talk about how we put this all together. Archaeology and history are two separate approaches for getting a picture of what happened to the past human behavior. So archaeology uses the material record, cultural materials we call it, material culture, I always get that one backwards. This is the stuff that is left behind. These are the things that people manufactured, the things that they used, things that they consumed, leftovers from food items, processed bone from butchering. These are residues that they leave behind. These are the broken tools and implements that they made. These are the buildings or structures that they lived in. All of this stuff is ultimately abandoned into the record, and where archaeologists try to piece it back together. History, on the other hand, uses written and oral accounts of the past to construct a narrative. They're looking at those voices of the people that were actually present. And history, to some extent, is also self-consuming in that it also looks at the works of previous historians to sort of refine the picture of the past. Bancroft, for example, was writing about the California gold rush within a couple of years of the actual gold rush. So his history of the gold rush is itself a historical account now. It is a common trope that you hear among pre-contact archaeologists that historical archaeology isn't really real archaeology, it's a form of applied history. And historians dismiss historical archaeology as well, saying that it's just some sort of bastard archaeology, not what they do. So to make sense of it all, we use a whole slew of different toolkits. So if we're looking at the material record, we look at what it's made out of. We're looking at evidence of how it was used, wear marks, how it was broken. We look at the proteins that were left behind or the DNA. There's a wonderful study from Virginia City that looks at medical syringes from around the 1870s, and they were able to use GCMS, gas chromatograph mass spectrometer, to identify the medicine that was actually in the syringes. This is the same technology that the police use. And they were able to extract DNA as well and come up with an idea of the gender and ethnicity of the people that use these things. We can do replicative studies, so we can reproduce, for a pre-contact archaeologist, we can reproduce spear points or arrowheads. We can do flint knapping. And this not only gives us an idea about the tool itself, but also about the waste products that are produced when we make these things. And so when we find those flakes on the ground, if we've done flint knapping, we have an idea of what stages they were in, maybe what they were making. For historical archaeology, you get the same sort of benefits. In Williamsburg, not only are they getting material that is appropriate for period-sensitive reconstruction, but they're also learning about the archaeological traces that would be left by a brickmaking operation, so that when they see an anomalous circular pit or a deposit of really crappy soft bricks, they have an idea of what was going on at that location. We also look at how these items were deposited in the archaeological record, why they were abandoned. It's rather interesting in the history of archaeology that wasn't until really the 1950s that it occurred to anybody that the things that we find in the ground are not in the same condition that they were when they entered the ground or when they were being used. There's these two concepts of systemic and archaeological context. A systemic context is the context in which something is used. The guy makes himself an arrowhead, he hafts it onto that arrow. That is systemic context. He then shoots it at the deer. That's also systemic context, but he misses. It hits a tree or a rock, it breaks, he leaves it in the ground. Now it's in the archaeological context. 1,000 years go by, somebody picks it up and says, you know, I can reuse this thing. And they notch it again, and they haft it onto an arrow, and they shoot it at a bunny, and they miss, and it goes back into the archaeological record. These things go through cycles. We see this also with the mining industry. If we look at the Keys Mill down in Keysville, you find timbers in the mill building that have empty mortises or empty screw holes or empty nail holes in them, and this is because they were salvaged from somewhere else and brought down and reused. If you look at the sheet metal siding of the building, you'll find hand-painted addresses on it from all over the state. So they went up to Benton, for example, and salvaged building material from a building there. We know this because there's an address to Benton on the Nevada and California Railroad, the narrow gauge that was in operation in the early 1900s. And actually it's a pretty narrow window because that railroad had been formerly called the Carson and Colorado before 1900, and shortly after 1900 it ultimately was renamed the Southern Pacific as part of that larger railroad system. And so by looking at how these things are used, deposited, picked up, reused, we can construct something of the lifeways of the material record. When we look at history, this seems like it would be a pretty solid source of information. After all, somebody who actually saw what happened wrote it down. There's a lot of biases that can be built into written history, however. There was an interesting study that was done when I was a student. They took a class of psychology majors, some 60-odd students in a lecture hall, and they showed them a short video of a car wreck. So you got a four-way stop, and there's a red car waiting at the red light. The light turns green. He pulls forward and gets broadsided by a black car who ran the red light. Pretty cut and dried. And so they asked the students to fill out a questionnaire. What did the red car do? What did the black car do? Did any other cars move through the intersection? Stuff like that. And one of the questions is, what did the blue car do? Well, there's no blue car. And the students answered correctly. There is no blue car. They brought them back 6 weeks later and said, so what happened with the blue car? And almost all of them said, well, the blue car was hit. The blue car ran the red light also. The blue car dodged the whole thing. None of them lined up, but they all had something to say about the blue car, which wasn't actually present. And so memories can be constructed. And so when we're looking at the written record, we have to treat it as not being concrete, but actually relative. Oral history is subject to the same thing as well, and of course, oral history also depends on the accuracy of how it's transmitted. It seems like it'd be a pretty sketchy thing to hang your hat on, but actually there's some pretty good evidence that oral history can preserve stuff for literally thousands of years. If you ever read the Iliad or the Odyssey in school, you know, Homer's account of the Trojan War, in the Iliad he talks about the Scamander Plain where most of the battles took place. Homer composed his poetry around 700 years BC. The Trojan War, however, occurred almost 700 years before he was born. And so there's no way he was an eyewitness to this, and there is no thought that he actually traveled there. And so the description of the plain is something that was preserved orally, that he had learned from another oral epic poet. In the midst of the Iliad, you see there's an episode where the Greek army armor is out there going to attack the Trojans, and one of the heroes dons a helmet that was made out of boar's tusks. And it's very lovingly described, and these weren't actually known in the time of Homer. These helmets have been found archaeologically. They date to about 1400. They were not being used in Homer's time, so any memory that he could have had of these things was from that oral epic tradition. There was a study also in the 1950s of oral epic poetry being composed in Yugoslavia. And they were able to trace elements back to written transcriptions of these same poems from 400 or 500 years previously. And they were very, very accurate. And they were also able to find elements that went all the way back to Homer. And even some suggestion that they might go all the way back to the Epic of Gilgamesh, which is the earliest piece of literature that we have any record of. So the upshot is that oral history can be accurate. The written record can be accurate, but you also need to control for any potential inaccuracies, biases. If, for example, you used the Havilah Courier in 1866 as a bellwether for the politics of the nation at the time, you would think that it was pretty rabidly pro-Confederacy. The opening editorial in issue 1 of the Havilah Courier talks about how democracy is the government of the white man for the privilege of the white race. Clearly that would not be the opinion in, say, Boston at the same time period. And so you have to be controlling for the biases that are present in these records. At the end of the day, what we do is we put all of these things together, and it's this sort of Venn diagram that we have here. We start with the archaeological record. This is the stuff we find on the ground. The bricks up at the Harley Mine, the bricks up in Bull Run. We look at how they're made, the striations, the tool marks, and so forth. We look at the historical records, so the articles in the Daily Alta California. We're also looking at histories written of the time period, so Lynn Bailey's work on shaft furnaces, for example, or the work on aerial tramways. And then we look to analogy. So this is the work that's being done in Jamestown or Williamsburg, where they're reproducing these things, or our Norwegians constructing their lime kiln. And we use those as an analogy to provide some insight into what could have happened here. We combine these things, the archaeological record, the historical record, and the analogy, and in this space in the middle, we construct our narrative of past human behavior. If we're really diligent, it is a fairly accurate narrative. In the postmodern period, at the beginning of well, I didn't need those anyways. In the postmodern period, it was really common for the social sciences to look at records such as these as being relative rather than concrete. Some of this is looking at those biases that I was talking about, but in its extreme, it resulted really in the writing of fiction. There was one famous PhD dissertation that constructed the entire lifeways of a group of people from a single artifact. And the children are singing, and the women are happily grinding their food, and the hunters are bringing in the deer, and so on, all from a single artifact. And so due diligence requires us to use the best range of sources that we have, that we put together this sort of Venn diagram, and we construct our story. But at the end of the day, it is still storytelling. All good stories, oftentimes we're left with more questions than we have with answers. Some of my colleagues in the world of archaeology like to think of it as a science, but at the end of the day, we are simply storytellers. And in the case of this project, a couple of weeks ago, I was sitting down at Dick Weed's having dinner. I looked up at the wall, and there's a picture of the A. Brown store in Kernville, which, the A. Brown store burned in right around 1890 or so, and was reconstructed in brick, a more fireproof building. And I thought to myself, I wonder where that came from. So more to come, I suppose. So, and that's all I got. Any questions? What's that?
The dog has a question.
The dog, yes.
I've got crucibles out of the oven from Bull Run.
Oh, cool. Yeah, I've found a few fragments of crucibles where I think the assay shop was. In fact, that's why I think it's the assay shop. Right on.
I got mine in like 57.
Yeah. Yeah, it was a lot more there when I first visited in '89. I mean, it has really been picked apart over the years. Jane?
You mentioned that the Big Blue Mine had a sawmill up on Waggy Flat. Was that the
same mill that A. Brown had, or did he have a different?
He purchased it from them.
He purchased.
Yep. So the neat thing up there is they had a pond, and that's where the ice in town came from as well. So, and that's an interesting site. I had hunted for it on several occasions over a period of years before the French fire, and couldn't find anything. And then after the French fire, I went down there and I found footings for the machinery and artifacts, all kinds of stuff. It was just completely covered over with duff and, jackstraw trees and whatnot. So it's an interesting little site. And there is no remnant of the pond at all, which I think is interesting.
Thank you, Tim.
Mike?
Oh, go ahead, Mike.
So you don't think they actually made the bricks up where they're found?
So I think that the bricks were made down in the flats below the mill, at this second smaller site.
Because you had to have clay material, and there's no clay material.
And that is an interesting question. I mean, the site is pretty diagnostic as to what happened. You've got the pit, you've got different piles of different grades of bricks, you've got a spot where I think they built their clamp, where you have a lot of these really burned bricks. So I think clearly they were made there, but the clay source is a total mystery to me. And obviously it wasn't a very good clay source, because again, it has all that crap in it. It looks a little bit like some material that you find about 2 miles up the trail, the Whiskey Flat Trail. But again, when it's been wet up there, I've balled it up, and it's not a lot of clay in the soil. So that's one of the questions I have is where did the clay come from? Off the top of my head, the best source that I could think of would be like in the Saddle Springs Road area, or just over Hooper Hill going down into Havilah, where you got some really clay-based soils. Driving Saddle Springs Road in the rain is a lot of fun.
So,
John.
The thing that amazes me is what happens across the street at the annex is a little bit like what Tim did when he went and found bricks on the top of Howard Peak. Is that it starts a whole, what we call going down the rabbit hole. And before you know it, you've got a whole book ahead of you, and all you did is come out with more questions and more books. But it's amazing that you can follow that trail. I really appreciate that.
This is the danger digging into it. Stop it.
but you'll let us know when you find out where the bricks for A. Brown's from.
I will. Actually, I'm fascinated by this, and I suspect that folks here probably have some of these bricks maybe in their fireplace. I mean, I imagine they were all salvaged in the late 1940s when the town was moved, and they went somewhere. I would love to see one and see if it's the same sort of quality that we found in Bull Run. Did the A. Brown Company retool the Harley brickyard and produce more bricks? I mean, the A. Brown Company had all kinds of commercial contacts. They could have ordered bricks and had them shipped, but that would have been really expensive. They could have been, by rail down to Bakersfield, or, maybe brought up in through the Porterville area and through Lynn's Valley, but it would have been exorbitantly expensive. So I imagine they were made here somewhere. And the mortar is still interesting to me because I've never found anything that suggested a lime kiln. So these things tend to be self-consuming as well. If you build it out of that marble, probably you don't have a lot of it left when you're done with it, but I don't know. So hopefully we have a chance to find out more.
Thank you, Tim.
Oh, thank you.